Our story today begins on a damp morning, April 12th, 1862. It's the first anniversary of the attack on Fort Sumter, the day the American Civil War began. But the scene isn't a battlefield. It's a small railroad depot in Marietta, Georgia, deep in the heart of the Southern Confederacy. A group of about 20 men dressed in civilian clothing quietly board a northbound train. They are Union soldiers, but they aren't carrying flags and they wear no blue uniforms. Their mission isn't to fight, but to steal the very locomotive pulling the cars they are riding in, and to use it to tear the Confederacy in two. It's a mission so audacious, so improbable, that it would become one of the most legendary episodes of the entire American Civil War. This is the story of the Andrews Raid, better known as the Great Locomotive Chase. To understand why these men were willing to risk everything, even death, we have to look at the strategic chessboard of the war in the spring of 1862. In the Western Theater, Union armies are on the march. Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Don Carlos Buell are pushing south after capturing Confederate strongholds like Fort Henry and Donelson in Tennessee. The Union strategy was to sever the Confederacy's vital arteries of communication and supply, to choke the rebellion by cutting its lifelines. And at the center of this strategy was a small but crucial city, Chattanooga, Tennessee. With a population of just over 2,500 people, Chattanooga was a strategic linchpin of the First Order. It was called the key to East Tennessee and the gateway to the Deep South. Its importance wasn't in its size, though. It was in its location. 4 major railroad lines radiated in and out of the city, connecting it to the industrial centers of the South with the armies in the field. To control Chattanooga was to control the movement of troops and supplies across a vast portion of the Confederacy. Abraham Lincoln understood this with perfect clarity. He once wrote that taking and holding the railroad that ran through the region was, in his words, quote, fully as important as the taking and holding of Richmond, end quote. The most critical of these iron lifelines was the Western and Atlantic Railroad. This state-owned 138-mile track was the direct link between the industrial and logistical hub of Atlanta, Georgia, and the strategic fortress of Chattanooga. It was the primary supply route for the Confederate Army of Tennessee. To cut this railroad would be to isolate Chattanooga, leaving it vulnerable to capture. This was the context for the plan presented to Union General Ormsby Mitchell. The idea was simple in its conception and breathtaking in its audacity. A small team of volunteers operating in secret would steal a train heading north from Atlanta. As they raced toward Chattanooga, they would destroy the railroad behind them, burning bridges, tearing up track, and cutting telegraph wires. This act of sabotage was timed to coincide with General Mitchell's own troops advancing on Chattanooga. With its main supply line severed, the city would be unable to receive reinforcements and would fall into Union hands. It was a plan that relied on stealth, deception, and an incredible amount of nerve. It was a new kind of warfare, aimed not at an army in the field, but at the industrial infrastructure that kept that army in the field. And it would all depend on the man chosen to lead it. The leader of this improbable mission was not a soldier. James Andrews was a civilian, a man of a shadowy background and shifting identities. Born in Virginia, he had settled in Kentucky, where he'd worked as a house painter and a singing coach. When the war broke out, he found a new and dangerous trade as a Union secret agent and scout, moving between the lines under the guise of a contraband smuggler, dealing goods like quinine. He was a man comfortable with deception, possessing the unique skills of subterfuge and knowledge of the Southern Territory that a conventional military officer would lack. At the time of the raid, he was engaged to be married to a woman named Elizabeth Layton, a personal detail that adds a layer of tragedy to the story that was about to unfold. Now, it's interesting to note that this wasn't Andrews' first attempt at such a scheme. He had previously proposed a similar raid to General Don Carlos Buell with the goal of burning a key bridge over the Tennessee River. Now, that mission had fizzled out before it even began when the local railroad engineer he had recruited failed to show up at the rendezvous. But undeterred, Andrews refined his plan and brought it to General Mitchell. Mitchell was struggling with the strategic problem of how to capture the geographically fortified Chattanooga, and he saw Andrews' raid as the key and gave it his full approval. So Andrews set about recruiting his team. He was joined by another civilian, William Campbell from Salineville, Ohio, and 22 volunteer soldiers from 3 Ohio infantry regiments, the 2nd, the 21st, and the 33rd. These men were given their instructions: get rid of your uniforms, dress in civilian clothes, and make your way south in small groups of 2 or 3 men. Their cover story was that they were Kentuckians, disillusioned with the Union and traveling to Georgia to enlist in the Confederate Army. Their rendezvous point was the town of Marietta. The journey south was perilous itself. The entire mission was delayed by a day due to torrential downpours of rain. The men traveled through hostile territory, constantly at risk of being discovered. The inherent danger of their mission became clear almost immediately. 2 of the volunteers were captured before they even reached the rendezvous point. 2 others, following their contingency plan after getting separated, actually enlisted in a Confederate artillery unit to maintain their cover. The raiding party was shrinking before the raid had even begun. In a final stroke of bad luck, 2 more men would oversleep on the morning of the raid and literally miss the train. The grand plan was being chipped away by misfortune and the friction of reality. The civilian status of their leader, while providing the necessary skills for the infiltration, also created a critical vulnerability. Andrews and his men were operating outside the understood rules of war, a fact that would have devastating consequences for them all. On the morning of April 12th, the remaining raiders gathered in James Andrews' hotel room in Marietta for a final, hushed briefing. He told them to buy tickets, board the same passenger car on the northbound train, and to say nothing. They were to wait for his signal when the train made its scheduled breakfast stop at a small station called Big Shanty. They filed out and boarded the train, pulled by a handsome wood-burning locomotive of the 440 type, named the General. At the helm was its conductor, a determined 25-year-old named William Allen Fuller. The choice of Big Shanty, now in the city of Kennesaw, was deliberate and strategic. It was one of the few stations on the line that had no telegraph office. A train could be stolen from there without the immediate alarm being sent up the line to Chattanooga. But as the train pulled into the station, the raiders saw an unforeseen and intimidating complication. Right beside the tracks was Camp McDonald, a large Confederate training facility. They could see armed sentries pacing their beats as the train hissed to a stop. The call was made for a 20-minute breakfast break at the Lacey Hotel adjacent to the station. William Fuller, the conductor, his engineer, Jeff Kane, and the railroad's foreman of motive power, Anthony Murphy, who was riding as a passenger, all disembarked and went inside to eat. This was the moment. Andrews gave the signal. The raiders moved with quiet efficiency. While some stood lookout, the men with railroad experience, including Wilson Brown and William Knight, swiftly uncoupled the passenger and baggage cars from the rest of the train. They left the locomotive, its fuel tender, and 3 empty boxcars connected. They clambered aboard, threw the engine into gear, and with a chuff of steam, the General began to pull out of the station. Inside the Lacey Hotel, Fuller and his crew heard the sound of the engine and coupling pins. They rushed outside, stunned to see their train steaming down the track. Fuller's first assumption was that Confederate deserters from the nearby camp had stolen the train to make their escape. But his immediate concern was not for the military implications. It was a matter of professional duty. As a conductor, he was the captain of his train. A deserted locomotive blocking the single track line would cause chaos for miles. Without a moment's hesitation, William Fuller, along with Kane and Murphy, did the only thing they could think to do. They started running. The Great Locomotive Chase had begun, not with the thunder of cannons, but with the frantic pounding of 3 men's feet on the gravel of the railroad bed. The raiders' carefully laid plan was about to collide with the furious, improvised reaction of one incredibly determined man. Aboard the General, Andrews' men set to work. Their plan was to maintain a normal schedule between stations to avoid suspicion, but to stop in the remote stretches in between to inflict their damage. They paused to cut telegraph wires, silencing the line behind them. They also attempted to pry up rails, but without the proper tools, it was a slow, laborious process. Early in the chase, they faced a critical decision. After crossing the large wooden bridge over the Etowah River, they spotted another locomotive, the Yonah, sitting on a siding near some ironworks. The bridge was a key target. One of the raiders, an engineer named William Knight, urged Andrews to stop, burn the bridge, and disable the Yonah. But Andrews, who feared a firefight with the workers at the foundry, overruled him. He chose to prioritize speed and stealth over a primary mission objective. It was a cautious decision that would ultimately prove to be a fatal mistake. The raiders' carefully planned timetable soon began to fall apart. At the station in Kingston, they were shunted onto a siding to wait for a scheduled southbound freight train. But to their dismay, they learned there were extra unscheduled trains coming south, filled with supplies and men. They were stuck for over an hour. This unforeseen logistical snag was a disaster for the raid, eroding the precious head start they had tried so hard to take advantage of. Andrews had to use all his cunning to bluff his way through, telling the suspicious station master that he was running an emergency powder train under direct orders from General Beauregard. The ruse worked, but the damage was done. The clock was ticking. Behind them, William Fuller was proving to be astonishingly relentless. After running on foot for several miles, he and his men found a track crew's hand car and continued the pursuit, pumping furiously. They were briefly thrown from the tracks by the first section of rail the raiders had removed, but they managed to heave the heavy car back onto the line and push onward to Etowah Station. There, Fuller's luck began to turn. He found the very locomotive Andrews had declined to destroy, the Yonah. Commandeering the old yard engine, he steamed north, arriving in Kingston just minutes after the raiders had finally cleared the traffic jam. At Kingston, the track ahead was still blocked. Fuller abandoned the Yonah, ran through the congested rail yard, and took control of another locomotive, the William R. Smith. A few miles north, he was stopped again by another section of torn-up track. Once again, Fuller and his men got out and ran. After 2 miles on foot, they saw a plume of smoke approaching from the north. It was the southbound freight train pulled by the locomotive Texas. In a moment of brilliant improvisation, Fuller flagged down the Texas, explained the situation, and took command. There was no time to turn the engine around on a siding. He had its freight cars uncoupled, ordered the engineer to throw it in reverse, and began chasing the general at high speed backwards. The chase had now become a desperate, high-speed duel. With the Texas thundering in reverse just behind them, the raiders no longer had time to stop and tear up tracks. They tried to slow their pursuers by throwing railroad ties onto the rails and uncoupling 2 of their boxcars, but Fuller deftly maneuvered around the obstacles. Near Resaca, they made one last desperate attempt to achieve a key objective. They set their final boxcar on fire and left it in the middle of the covered wooden bridge over the Oostenaula River. but the wood of the bridge was still damp from recent rains. The fire sputtered and failed to catch. The Texas simply pushed the smoldering car off the bridge and continued its relentless pursuit. The raiders' plan had been clever, but it was too rigid. It was being systematically dismantled by bad luck, unforeseen delays, and the incredible adaptive tenacity of one man, William Fuller. The chase had raged for nearly 7 hours and covered nearly 90 miles. Aboard the General, the situation was now dire. The close pursuit by the Texas had made it impossible for the raiders to stop for more wood and water. The fuel in the tender was nearly gone, and the boiler's pressure was falling fast. Just 18 miles south of their goal of Chattanooga, north of the town of Ringgold, the General gave its last gasp. The locomotive slowed to a crawl and finally ran out of steam. The Great Locomotive Chase was over. Andrews gave his final order: jump from the train, scatter into the woods, and try to make it back to Union lines on foot. As the raiders disappeared into the Georgia wilderness, a massive manhunt began. Confederate soldiers and local citizens fanned out across the countryside using bloodhounds to track the fugitives. The raiders were exhausted and disoriented, and they stood little chance. Within a week, every single one of them was captured, including the 2 men who had overslept in Marietta and missed the chase entirely. They were rounded up and thrown into a squalid jail in Chattanooga. Their imprisonment was, well, let's just say it wasn't good. The captured men were held in a single semi-underground cell known as the Hole. It was barely 13 feet square, not enough room for all of them to lie down at once. They were chained together around the neck, swarmed by vermin, and barely given enough food to survive in the oppressive heat. This was not the treatment afforded to prisoners of war. The raiders had been captured behind enemy lines in civilian clothes. In the eyes of the Confederacy, they weren't soldiers, they were spies. One of the youngest raiders was Private Jacob Parrott of the 33rd Ohio, and he was singled out for particularly brutal treatment. In an effort to force a confession about the mission's objectives and the identities of his comrades, he was stripped and viciously whipped more than 100 times with rawhide. 3 times the flogging was stopped, and he was asked to talk. 3 times he refused. His silence in the face of such torture was an act of incredible bravery. The trials that followed were swift and predetermined. The men were charged with unlawful acts of belligerency. Their defense counsel argued that their mission was a purely military one and therefore a legitimate act of war. The argument was dismissed. James Andrews was tried first and quickly sentenced to death. As General Mitchell's army continued its advance toward Chattanooga, the other prisoners were moved to Knoxville, where 7 more were hastily tried and condemned to hang. The very nature of their mission, its reliance on disguise and deception, had stripped them of any protections offered to uniformed combatants, and it sealed their fate. As the Union Army drew closer, the Confederate authorities moved the condemned raiders again to a more secure prison in Atlanta. On June 7, 1862, James Andrews, who had briefly escaped from jail only to be recaptured, was led to the gallows. The execution was horribly botched. The scaffold had been built too low, and when the trap was sprung, Andrews' feet touched the ground. He died slowly and agonizingly of strangulation. 11 days later, on June 18th, 7 more men met the same fate. They were hanged together in Atlanta. William Campbell, the other civilian, Sergeant John Scott, Sergeant Major Marion Ross, and Privates Samuel Robertson, Charles Shadrach, Samuel Slavens, and George Wilson. This execution was also grimly mishandled. When the platform dropped, 2 of the ropes snapped, and the condemned men fell to the ground only to be hanged again an hour later. The remaining 14 prisoners, now certain they were next, resolved to escape. On the afternoon of October 16th, they made their move. They overpowered their jailer, broke out of their cell, and burst into the prison yard, surprising the guards. In the ensuing chaos, 8 of the raiders managed to get over the walls and escape into the city. After uniquely harrowing journeys, they traveled hundreds of miles through enemy territory, and all 8 miraculously made it back to Union lines. The 6 men who were caught during the escape attempt were eventually released in a prisoner exchange in March of 1863. They were brought to Washington, D.C. to meet with their fellow Ohioan, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and recount their story. Their tale of daring, suffering, and fortitude made a profound impression. At the time, the United States was in the process of implementing a new military decoration to honor valor in combat. The story of the Andrews Raiders provided the perfect inaugural recipients. And so on March 25th, 1863, these 6 exchanged prisoners became the first men in American history to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Private Jacob Parrott, that young soldier who had endured a brutal whipping without breaking, was considered officially the very first man to receive it. In time, most of the others who participated in the raid would also receive the medal, many of them posthumously. As civilians, James Andrews and William Campbell were ineligible for the honor. I had the privilege of visiting Chattanooga. Chattanooga National Cemetery is where one of the great American Medal of Honor recipients is buried, and that's Desmond Doss. If you've seen his story in the movie Hacksaw Ridge, he's buried there at Chattanooga National Cemetery, but so are the men, including James Andrews and William Campbell, the 2 civilians. They're buried in a semicircle together in a monument near the front of the cemetery, and the men who received the Medal of Honor are buried there as well, all executed because of their crimes against the Confederacy during the war. It's an incredible place to visit. And while you're in Chattanooga, you can visit the Medal of Honor Heritage Center, which is a wonderful place. You can see Desmond Doss's Medal of Honor. It's on display there. There's a wonderful display for Alvin York, who was another famous son of Tennessee who received the Medal of Honor during the Great War. And you can see displays for a number of those stories. Another story told there is Arthur MacArthur, who was a young field officer in a Wisconsin regiment who led a charge up Missionary Ridge outside Chattanooga and was the father of Douglas MacArthur, another recipient of the Medal of Honor. But back to our story. The Andrews Raid, a mission that was a complete tactical and strategic failure, became a foundational event in the history of American military valor. It achieved none of its objectives. The railroad tracks were quickly repaired, and Chattanooga would remain in Confederate hands for another year and a half. But the story of the raid, the bravery, the suffering, the defiance, transformed a failed mission into an enduring symbol of heroism. Its historical importance comes not from what it accomplished, but from the human drama it created. A drama so powerful that it gave birth to the nation's highest military honor. But our story doesn't end there. The story of the Great Locomotive Chase goes on. Its 2 non-human protagonists, the locomotives, the General and the Texas, would go on to have long and storied lives of their own. The General, the stolen engine, survived the war. It was repaired and put back into service on the Western and Atlantic. In the 1870s, it was completely rebuilt, receiving a new boiler and a diamond-shaped smokestack for burning coal, which significantly altered its wartime appearance. After being retired in 1891, its historic significance was recognized. It was saved from the scrapyard and beautifully restored in order to be exhibited at the 1893 World's Exposition in Chicago. For decades, it was a celebrated artifact, touring the country for fairs and the Civil War centennial in the 1960s. After a lengthy legal battle over its ownership, the locomotive was finally given a permanent home. Today, the General sits as the centerpiece of the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia, just a few hundred yards from the very spot at Big Shanty where it was stolen so many years ago. Now, what about the Texas, that dogged pursuer? It also survived the war and continued its long career on the railroad, eventually being renamed the Cincinnati for a time. It was retired in 1907 and, like the General, was saved from being scrapped by a public campaign led by the women of Atlanta. For a number of years, it sat in the basement of the city's Cyclorama building. In 2015, it was moved to the Atlanta History Center for a major restoration, but the curators made a fascinating choice. Instead of restoring it to its 1862 appearance, they restored it to how it looked in the 1880s. Their goal was to tell a different story, not just one dramatic day, but of the engine's 50 years of service and its role in the difficult, complex era of Reconstruction that followed the war. And so these two iron horses, once locked in a desperate race through the Georgia countryside, now rest in quiet dignity in museums just miles apart. One, the General, is preserved as a monument to a single heroic moment of conflict. The other, the Texas, stands as a witness to the long and often complicated history that came after. Together, they preserve the memory of the Andrews Raid, a story of incredible courage, tragic failure, and the birth of an American legend. The dramatic tale of the raid would continue to capture public imagination long after the war ended, eventually inspiring one of the great masterpieces of the silent film era. In 1926, the comedian and filmmaker Buster Keaton released a film called The General, a cinematic retelling of the chase. The film was based on a memoir written by one of the raiders, William Pittenger, but Keaton made a crucial change to the story. Fearing that American audiences in the 1920s wouldn't accept Confederates as villains, he flipped the narrative entirely. In Keaton's version, the hero is a brave Confederate engineer named Johnny Gray, based on the real-life conductor William Fuller, who needs to recapture his beloved locomotive from bumbling Union spies. While filled with spectacular stunts and hilarious historical inaccuracies, the film cemented the Great Locomotive Chase in the popular imagination, ensuring that the story of this daring raid would become an enduring American legend. Thanks for listening.